Hello. Quick preface here before I get into the story. This entire thing was posted on the D&D subreddit, so if your preference is to read these sorts of stories, then I will go ahead and leave a link in the description. This will be mostly audio only, so feel free to continue doing whatever it was you were doing before you clicked on this video. For context, this story takes place not that long ago, right around the time of my 30th birthday. I wasn't a happy camper at the time, and this experience helped to pull me out of the proverbial dumpy dumps, but more importantly, it helped to reinvigorate my love for tabletop RPGs. As the title suggests, this is a story about how I ran a game of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition for a group of people who were completely new to the concept of tabletops as well as to role-playing as a whole. First, I'll set up a little bit of backstory to this event, and then I'll get into the game itself. Also, strap yourselves in because this is going to be a long one. I am someone who tends to self-reflect a lot, and I recently discovered that I had developed two major problems that were preventing me from enjoying Dungeons & Dragons to its fullest. The first is a phenomenon that me and my friends call gunk brain. I tend to think about it visually like the grease that goes into a piece of industrial mechanical equipment. The longer that equipment runs, the more gunked up the grease on the inside becomes, so you need to change your grease every once in a while in order to keep your brain from getting gunked up. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons and tabletops for about 8 years now, so not as long as some veterans, but long enough to have formed my own opinions and biases. While this has sometimes been a positive thing, as it has led me to making more adventurous and out-of-the-box characters as I developed my tastes and experiences, it has also ingrained many expectations about games and how they're meant to be played. This mindset has affected how I perceive the setting of the game, how monsters are meant to behave, how spells are intended to work, etc. So, through experience, I have become more comfortable with the systems of the game, but at the same time, I have lost a lot of the initial discovery and wonderment that helped me to fall in love with the game to begin with. The second problem I have is a general fear of DMing. As you might be able to tell by now, I enjoy telling stories, and long ones at that. So you'd figure that would make me a natural fit for DMing, but almost all of my experiences with it have been negative. When I dungeon master, I tend to over-prepare and focus on a story that might only appeal to me, and I tend to get really stressed out when my players throw me unexpected curveballs. I am, for whatever reason, very bad at this form of improv, and I have a hard time staying in character as the DM if there are a number of NPCs in a single scene. That being said, having once run a continuous game of Dungeons & Dragons for about 50 sessions or so, or about 1.5 years, and having made many mistakes along the way, I did slowly pick up on what it was that I was doing wrong and how I could improve this in the future. To this day though, when my current group ever asks me to Dungeon Master, I tend to scratch the big bald spot on the top of my head where all my hair used to be before I Dungeon Mastered, and then I'll just say, I'm good. So the actual story starts about a month and a half ago. I'll keep the personal details brief, but my family and I were on a vacation at a spot on an island with an impressive view of the beach. I was in a bummer mood as I had mentioned, but it was still my birthday, so my family asked if I had any plans. I made an offhand comment about it being a shame that I didn't prepare a game of Dungeons & Dragons, which is something that I had threatened them with in the past. Then they simply asked, well, why don't you? My usual excuses seemed a little weaker this time around, as a heat wave was keeping us mostly indoors, and so it seemed as though the entire week might go off without anything memorable about it. So I ended up agreeing to run a game for my family. My mom, my dad, my eldest brother with his wife, and my other older brother with his boyfriend. I actually lost some sleep on the night that I made this decision, as I wasn't sure how they would react to me doing different voices and giving long descriptions and so on, because that whole tabletop side of me is something they've never had to interact with before. I also realized that it might be difficult to try to convey what Dungeons & Dragons is meant to be to a group of people who have never seen a pen and paper game before. They were surprised to learn that the game used dice, so that is the level of knowledge that most of them are floating at. Thankfully, the younger of my two older brothers had already played the game before and had his character in mind, so he was willing to help coach everyone else along the process so that it wasn't just me trying to explain what all the different little empty boxes were on the character sheet. That being said, I decided that the character sheet ultimately was not going to be the focus of the first night. What I wanted to accomplish was for the players to sit down at the table and to describe to them what options they had in terms of making characters, aka the classes, the races, and the backgrounds. Then, after that, I would get them to roll their own stats and then go over how the game was actually meant to be played using the dice. It was essentially a session 0, but what I had hoped to do was to establish a good enough foundation for a clean one-shot that would turn into a game that everyone would remember and enjoy. So, how did the game actually go? Well, the event ended up being split into 3 different nights. One for the character creation, and then the last 2 nights for the actual game, which included a surprisingly long conclusion. Saying that my players surprised me a few times during the entire process would be putting it very lightly, and the first couple of surprises would come right at character creation. After I described each of the different classes, I began to ask them about what sorts of characters they wanted to create, and I was shocked to see that all of the new players, my mom, my dad, and my older brother and his wife, had already written down what classes they wanted to play and were ready to move on to the rest of the character sheet. So, at this point, I asked the players to describe the characters that they wanted to play, and I started with the 2 veteran players, my older brother and his boyfriend. I'll take a moment now to describe each of the characters, but I wanted to remark on how impressed I was by what my family managed to come up with. Maybe it has something to do with the age, as each of them have been through enough of life as to not feel intimidated by sharing their creations, or they just don't care about being judged like that anymore. Anyways, the 2 veteran players played Snownew and Cassidy, a warlock gnome and a human barbarian pirate duo respectively, who had a put the gnome in the backpack and then throw the gnome at the problem sort of dynamic, and those 2 were the least morally dubious of the characters. Next up was my dad's character, a tiefling rogue with the faceless background who simply went by the name Faceless, but he also had a violent split personality who went by Nameless, who ends up making an appearance by the end of the campaign. As a whole, he was something of a roaming mercenary type who had very questionable intentions. My mom created Revis, a Raven Queen-styled warlock with a bonded raven familiar, who was an old elf of androgynous description from an ancient order of record keepers and sages whom treasured knowledge. My oldest brother, along with his wife, created Dolos, a portly half-orc rogue with the charlatan background whom the 2 played simultaneously, which created a very interesting dual personality dynamic in their roleplay, as well as establishing a theme of dual identities amongst the player characters. I really like this, but they described the Dolos as having come across a Western-style monk on the side of the road whom they had a disagreement with, resulting in his untimely end. They now wore his robes and tonsure to hide their true profession as well as hide all their weapons, and they used the monk as their secondary identity. From the very moment that they heard of each other's characters, the players, and specifically my dad, described how they were planning on killing the other players' characters. This might sound like a red flag, and it most certainly would be in any other group, but my family has this sort of weird, playful, competitive dynamic at some times, and so this wasn't of immediate concern of mine. Nor did I immediately correct my dad by telling him that the point of the game was to be cooperative. I had mentioned a few times that the game was meant to be entertainment first, and that it had a cooperative storytelling element to it. My usual DMing style is to let my players at least attempt whatever it is that they are describing, and then let them know what the consequences might be. I did slightly worry that the session might start out with an all-out bloodbath, and that the entire affair might end as a failed experiment, but we were sitting around and drinking and eating snacks and having casual conversations, so I wouldn't really mind that outcome as long as everyone was still having fun. So, I ended the night of Session 0 by asking a question which I will probably go on to ask all of my players in the future, which was, how did you all meet each other? I had had a pretty cataclysmic problem occur in the past, where I had let my players introduce themselves and how they were going to arrive in the first town. Some of them arrived together, some of them already lived in the region, and so on. And it made it so that those players tended to only interact with the characters whom they had arrived with, and I had a heck of a time trying to get them to interact with the other characters. My family answered this question by coming up with a unique scenario on their own. They met on a ship that had become wrecked on its way to port. and each of them took turns describing how they metaphorically pulled each other out of the fire, and then they trudged in soaking wet onto the shore to find a bar to drink away their misfortune. Faceless and/or Nameless, however, may have let Revis's original dog familiar drown, but I'm pretty sure the canonicity of that is still up in the air. I went on to describe to them how they would arrive at the singular tavern in a backwater/trade outpost where a representative of a wizard's faction was currently putting up a posting about a lost magical artifact. My last surprise of the first night came when, while I was still describing things out of characters to the players, my mom immediately began speaking, in character with a voice. She asked not only for details about the quest hook, but was attempting to haggle for a better reward than what was posted, which forced me to enter into DM mode during Session 0 and to come up with a voice for this NPC on the fly. Revis ended up rolling a 16 on Persuasion to convince the wizard that they were the team for the job and to increase the reward by 300 gold pieces, making the reward 100 pieces even per person. It was a great experience and it made my night, and it also made me excited for the first session. Keep in mind that no one even had character sheets by this point. This random outburst ended up being a great way of showing how to roll for skill checks and how to add bonuses, and also served as a demonstration of how the game itself is played and what the role of the DM was. On the first night of the actual game, I decided to start things off with the same tone that the previous night had ended. The party finishes trudging their way through thick forest for about a week, towards the last known location of their missing MacGuffin artifact. I made sure to remind my morally dubious party of all the things they could use their gold reward on post-success. This worked amazingly well, as it seemed to get all the players into the role-playing mood. I had counted my mom's previous performance the night before as something of a fluke, and I had expected that she might be the only person who would get a chance to roleplay with me. However, she seemed keen on staying in character, even if it was for out-of-character questions about game rules. She maintained her character's voice and also the inflection, and I think that helped to encourage the other players to try an inflection with their voice when they were speaking as their characters. For a while, there was some minor confusion about the role of the DM, as many of the players would speak to me as if I were an omniscient character that was floating just overhead, but after a while that passed. Eventually, my players came across their first obstacles in their journey. One was to figure out a safe path to navigate towards their now visible destination, and the second was to get past a door to enter into the newly discovered ruined tower. I had very little to do by this point, as the players were already conversing with each other about what it was that their characters could do, and eventually Revis used their Raven Familiar to scout out the path ahead. The door did stump them for a bit, as it tends to do even for veteran players for some reason, but when faced with the wall, Snownu and Cassidy opted to throw the gnome at the problem. I feel a little bad for Snownu, as I tended to use him for comedic moments whenever I thought it was appropriate to keep the tone of the game lighthearted. This meant that while he did successfully make it over to the other side of the wall, he landed in a large spiderweb that suspended him in the air. It was a small bit of improv on my part to create a bit of urgency as well as to hint at the enemies that were lurking within the building. This is the part where I started to notice myself becoming more comfortable with improv in general. I ended up making small changes to the adventure throughout to allow for a combination of actions to lead to a single solution. This way, even when the players rolled low, I could describe things in such a way so that it seemed like their contributions weren't wasted. Revis ended up casting their first spell, Spider Climb, in order to make it over the wall and to help cut down Snownu. Now, with players working on either side of the door, either by lockpicking or by simply trying to force it open, the big bad door was eventually defeated. By this point, all of the pressure of DMing was off, as I was 100% in my groove, and I knew that I had nothing else to worry about in terms of being rusty. What minor mistakes I ended up making were completely overshadowed by the fact that this was the player's first foray into Dungeons & Dragons, and fortunately for me, they were all completely naturals at it. There were still some small hurdles here and there, as well as a legendary conclusion to this campaign that I will never forget. The first combat ended up slowing things down a little bit, as the players became introduced to D&D's initiative system. The transition from free-flowing roleplay to turn-based action threw them for a loop. A few of them had issues trying to figure out why their plans didn't really line up with their character's action economy, and they weren't really clear with how the passage of time was meant to be interpreted in combat. For example, Faceless went first and entered into the dark room with a clear description of what it was he wanted to have happen. He described his character as launching an arrow at one spider and then turning quickly to dispatch the other two spiders that were in melee. My dad tended to use long descriptions for their character in general, emphasizing how slick and methodical that Faceless was in their execution. Meanwhile, the veteran players attempted to coach him into what actions were actually possible for his character to perform. I, for some reason, decided to let him continue describing things in this way throughout the rest of the game. I was simply blown away by how involved he was getting with his character, so I wanted to listen to what he had to say to the very end to understand what it was he wanted to get out of his action before I attempted to reel him back in and then move on to the other players' turns. This first combat served as a very good tutorial for them, and by the end they were really beginning to understand what options their character had, and I added a few spiders to the encounter so that each of them had a chance to kill at least one, with Dolos, who had been by far the unluckiest roller of the night, landing the final blow against the largest spider. This ended the first session, as it was getting quite late, and any time we had to play was limited to roughly 2 hours. Unfortunately, Dolos was not able to return for the wrap-up session, as they had other priorities that demanded that they couldn't stay up super late. Although, they did allow for Faceless, or perhaps Nameless, to kill their character out of game and put an end to their meta feud. Alright, so this wasn't in the original script, but I wanted to add how the two Dolos players ended up describing their own death. In the confusion of the battle, as the spiderwebs had caught fire, Dolos ended up tripping down a set of stairs and impaling themselves on all of the stolen goods and weapons that they had hidden in their paunch. What I thought was really cute is how they described themselves as having lived despite all these broken bones and multiple lacerations, because they knew that their character had the half-orc racial that would allow them to survive. However, needless to say, Dolos did not end up joining his companions on their short rest. The third night started, with the party needing to solve one more puzzle to open up the last chamber, where both the final encounter and the MacGuffin lay within. Once again, they managed to impress me with their ability to come up with solutions, despite not all of them being 100% necessary to actually complete the puzzle. Previously, they had uncovered a spellbook that belonged to the villain that was waiting for them, and the puzzle solution also included a mirror that reflected the room that they were in. They'd also failed a roll to understand the contents of the book last session, but instead of simply saying, "you can't read the book," I decided to say that the book was written in a cipher that they couldn't figure out. The players independently came up with the idea that in order to decode the cipher, they would first need to reflect the pages in the mirror. And I liked the idea so much that I ended up rolling with it, and I used it in order to set up the story of the villain. They eventually solved the puzzle, which involved lighting specific magical torches that were in the room in order to create a portal, which I described as being a one-way window that appeared as a flat wall from the room that they stood in, but was clearly magic to the detect magic-enhanced eyes of Snownu. My dad surprised me again, as he theorized that someone should stay on their side of the portal so that no one can snuff out the torches and lock them inside, and so Faceless volunteered to stay behind. Somehow, my dad had managed to pick up on something that even the adventure itself seemingly hadn't considered, and you bet he was going to use this to his advantage. This sets up the final encounter, as the remaining party, sans Faceless, entered the portal into a cold and dark room. Those with dark vision were able to make out that the MacGuffin was sitting in a pile of other magical items. However, at the same time, they began to hear the shifting and scuttling of a creature that was waiting for them inside. The monster spoke to them from the shadows, and after a few creepy taunts as well as jabs coming from both the players and the villain, eventually communications broke down as Revis attempted to retrieve the MacGuffin, which started the initiative order. This combat went amazingly better than the first, as the players were setting up actions in order to aid each other with their plans to deliver a finishing blow. Faceless, who could see nothing on his side of the portal, had given a rope to Revis to tie around the MacGuffin so that it could be pulled through at a moment's notice. On Faceless's turn, Revis verbally communicated to him the approximate location of the creature, who nearly hit him with a poisonous arrow despite shooting at disadvantage. Snownew on their turn then described using Mage Hand to grab the arrow and thrust it into the creature's singular eye, which was cool enough that I decided to allow it as an attack roll using his spellcasting modifier, which of course scored a critical hit. Cassidy then moved in to beat the creature with whatever it is that they could find laying around the room, breaking a small table over its head, while simultaneously Faceless pulled on the rope to retrieve the MacGuffin. What followed was my favorite moment of the night and probably my favorite finish to a combat encounter. The villain turned their now impaired gaze to the person who was attempting to steal their MacGuffin and carelessly began moving its way towards the portal, allowing Cassidy to score a crucial attack of opportunity. Faceless then backed away from the entrance of the portal, preparing a bow shot for the moment that the creature would leap through. Snownew on their turn then used an illusion to create the image of Faceless preparing their shot within clear view of the portal's entrance. The creature, thinking that Faceless was still unable to see them through the one-way wall, made an opportunistic leap directly at the illusion. Out of character, I asked Faceless to roll damage for their prepared attack, and with the added sneak attack damage it was exactly enough to reduce it to 0 HP. And so, I asked my dad the classic, "How do you want to do this?" question, and I expected him to simply describe the kill. What he ended up describing ended up pushing the conclusion of this story as well as the campaign to around 2 AM in the morning. Needless to say, many drinks were had this night. My dad took his time with his description, narrating to the rest of the group how the creature jumped to attack the illusion, and just as it realized it was duped, then turned to leap again at the real Faceless, just as the arrow passed directly through its eye. He then went on to describe how the creature continued forward with its momentum, where at this point the character had taken out 2 more arrows and then braced it against his chest, allowing the creature to impale itself as it tackled the 2 of them to the ground. There was a moment here in which the players were confused as to why my dad was being allowed to narrate the actions of another creature. I, on the other hand, was eating this whole thing up, and I could also tell that he wasn't quite finished with his description. Suddenly, his character's disposition had changed, and he said that he was now assuming his unsympathetic alter ego, Nameless. Without missing a beat, he described how he would snuff out the torches and seal the party inside the room, stealing the MacGuffin and disappearing with it forever. He even went as far as to say, "And that's how the story ends." Obviously, this did not fly with the other players, and after he finished his description, I made sure that he understood that his actions would essentially constitute a continuation to the combat so that the other players had an opportunity to stop him. After a quick moment, he agreed, and now it was clear to everyone that he had been planning this from the very start. However, the situation had changed since his initial setup. At this point in the combat, Cassidy had actually already managed to make it back outside of the portal, and my mom had remembered that Revis's familiar was still on Nameless's shoulder. There was only a single initiative pass for this entire conflict, because most of the real fighting was being done at the table. I did manage to reel them back in, and eventually the players did their best to describe what their characters were going to do to succeed over the others. In order, Faceless had managed to snuff out the torches to seal Revis inside, and went to grab for the MacGuffin, but the familiar went to grab at it at the same time, and actually managed to nab it first. Unable to comprehend the sudden betrayals coming from their allies, Cassidy managed to stop the Raven and cause it to drop the MacGuffin, and then Snownew used the Misty Step to retrieve it. The group exchanged some heated words in character, and after realizing that the situation had fallen out of his control, or more likely because he wanted to go to bed before 2 AM, my dad described his character as relenting and allowing Faceless to regain control of his faculties. As no one was gravely injured in this incident, it was somewhat glossed over, with the exception of Snownew and Cassidy, who decided it would be best for them to head their own way, taking with them what rewards they found inside the tower and leaving without the rest of the party or the MacGuffin. This left Revis and Faceless to decide what to do with it, who together decided that an artifact of its caliber could not be trusted to the group of wizards who had originally hired them. The two essentially agreed to become the Keepers of the MacGuffin, and to walk their own path, which could potentially lead to a continuation to the story somewhere down the line, should they ever want to play those characters again. And that is how it ended. I want to restate how much this experience helped me to improve my DMing, as well as to just improve my overall attitude in general. I was in a really bad headspace around this time for a multitude of reasons. One good game managed to completely turn that around and save that vacation for as far as I'm concerned, as it was easily the most memorable thing that happened. I don't really get to see my brothers that often, so this was great that I got to be able to do this at least once. And my parents still talk about the game today, and they discuss it on occasion with the two Dolos players, even when I'm not around. Since I ran this game, I have managed to be rid of a lot of the gunk that was in my brain surrounding DMing, as well as removed a lot of my reservations that I had about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition as well. I think it's the perfect system to introduce new players to, and if you are having second thoughts about DMing, or you are experiencing your own version of Gunk Brain, I'd recommend showing this game to a group of people whom you may not have at first thought to be this game's intended audience. I'll quickly wrap up by saying that I'll be here to answer any questions that you have in the comments section. There are tons of more stories and specifics about that particular event, but I couldn't possibly talk about all of them in this video. Sorry for the long rambling narration. I am still getting used to this process, and also kudos to those of you who made it the whole way through. I'm sure you got to enjoy getting to hear my voice change throughout the entire recording, as it took me that long to get it finished. I can definitely say that I learned a lot about recording during this process, and about microphones too, although I really wish I hadn't had to. Anyways, bye-bye. I love you.